Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my series into an introduction into qualitative methods, methods of qualitative research. We're beginning a new section. This is going to be section 1.3. I've completed a few hours, maybe 3-4 hours, probably more than 3 hours, 4 or 5 hours, on deconstructivist accounts and how a deconstructivist account can be applied to qualitative methods research, emphasizing concepts like the snag, the event, the happening, interpretation. We talked quite a bit about some of the key concepts as they apply to qualitative methodologies, but now we're going to shift gears. So we're moving from Derrida and deconstructivism to Guici-Spivak and marginalization and marginality. Guici-Spivak is most famously known for her concept of subalternity. I'm going to talk a little bit in this about subalternity. The truth of the matter is, however, that based on the reference, which is Thinking with Theory and Qualitative Research, the authors, again, this I think is a Routledge guide. It's a phenomenal book. It's a very, very good book, solid book. So I definitely recommend that you get the book. It's worth the investment, whatever the cost of the book is to get it. It's a very good book. Spivak is primarily known for sort of the articulation of subalternity in Can the Subaltern Speak? However, the authors have chosen to focus their analysis on how marginality is articulated within sort of a structuralist, post-structuralist critique, which is what Spivak also does. So I'm going to facilitate that discussion. So if you're thinking that a lot of my discussion here, is going to be about subalternity, it's not. It's going to be applied to marginalization, to oppression, if you will, not necessarily subalternity. And, you know, if you're interested in these types of studies, then Spivak would be good. So any Chicana experience, research paradigm, qualitative methodology, this would be good. Any first world, third world, comparative qualitative analysis, this research paradigm would be good. If you're more anthropological, if you're going to do fourth world communities, indigenous populations, this would be good. So obviously this research paradigm will apply to a very specific group of qualitative methodologists, and this is anyone doing, you know, more ethnography, participatory action research, wherein we're looking at the marginalization of communities. This research paradigm would be most applicable. Sorry. So with that, let's get a drink of H2O. And we begin. So, as you know, you can download the notes, click the link in the description field, it'll take you to the notes, and use the notes. This is going to be section 1.3, and this is Introduction to Methods of Qualitative Research. So, intro to... Right, Introduction to Methods of Qualitative Research, and this is section 1.3. Okay, so again, this is going to be part 1. I'm going to do several parts discussing Spivak's applicability to qualitative methodologies. I am particularly fond of Spivak's approach. Her brain is just amazing. Can the Subaltern Speak? I've probably read that article, I don't even know, 10 times maybe. And every time I revisit the text, I get more and more information out of it. Again, I'm not going to be talking about subalternity, but Spivak's deceptively complex. She seems as though, oh, well, these concepts are sort of simple and I can sort of grasp it. And as soon as you think you grasp it, it's like deconstructivism. You recognize the profundity of what's being said. So I have quite the task to try and make this applicable to qualitative research, but I'm confident in my preparation. So, important concepts, references. Bottom of page 7. The conceptual approach to marginalization via Spivak criticizes the discipline and notion of post-colonialism. Right? Now, in my nationalism video, I talked about colonialism and post-colonialism. I don't want to do an articulation of that. I might make notes to myself, because I just started. I would have to find it. As a matter of fact, that would be great. Now that I've completed when I was writing this, I hadn't yet shot my nationalism video series. I've completed the series, and I explicitly spend about 30 minutes talking about the evolution from colonialism to post-colonialism. It's a really good analysis. So I'm going to make a note to myself to link. Hopefully I can remember to do this and update the PDF. It won't facilitate a link in the physical document, but the PDF, I need to make a note to myself to do that, because I did a very sort of deconstructivist account of post-colonialism. So I'm not going to do that now. It would take 30-40 minutes, so I'm going to give you the super quick. I apologize if you don't know post-colonial theory, how it came about, but the long and short of it is colonizers came in and colonized. They colonized others. The objectification of others, the dehumanization of others facilitates colonization. Colonization is built on the concept of exporting violence, importing cash. Exporters of violence manifest itself in judicial systems, punishment, persecution, executions, mutilations, you name it. Think roads, think the colonization of the Congo as probably the most deplorable forms. And what is imported? Cash, resources, and such. Post-colonial theory looks back at colonialism and attempts to sort of free itself from colonialist mentalities. Colonizers also established a colonialist mentality, a colonialist mindset. Post-colonial theory is an attempt to free itself from colonialist mindset. So you would think that a critique, this is wrong, but you would think that a critique, number one, says the conceptual approach to marginalization via Spivak criticizes the discipline and notion of post-colonialism. You would think that insofar as, sort of counterintuitively, that a critique of post-colonialism would be a defense of colonialism. I apologize, there's no ghetto philosophy. Probably for the rest of this lecture series. We're in it. We're in the thick, right? So, post-colonialism is a critique of colonialist mentality. You would think that a critique of post-colonialism would be an affirmation of colonialist mentality, and it's not. What Spivak is doing is also a Nietzschean move, is to say that the presumption that post-colonialist theorists have freed themselves from colonialist discourse is false. And here are the hypocrisies. That's what she's doing. So we have colonialism, we have post-colonialism, and then we have Spivak's critique of post-colonialist theory, saying that post-colonialist theory is basically on par. There's a biconditional, you could actually logically demarcate this, right? You can sort of logically prove this via Spivak. This is why she's so freaking amazing. That post-colonialist theory is really a reincarnation, a reaffirmation, not in its totality. I know a lot of post-colonialist scholars have problems with this, but to be charitable to Spivak's theoretical approach, that a lot of post-colonialist theory is basically a re-articulation of the hegemonic force of colonialism, right? So what example might there be? I can give you an immediate, quick, contemporary account. Now, Spivak doesn't say this, but this is a Spivakian, right? This is beyond Spivak. This is a Spivakian critique of post-colonialist theory. So that you recognize in the United States, and this is super quick because I've got a lot to cover with Spivak, and if you don't get the basics now, you're not going to follow any of this. And it's really deep, to be honest with you. So 1950s, 1960s, civil rights movement in the United States. The whole point of the civil rights movement was to fight for the rights of African Americans within the diaspora of the United States, right? So that African Americans moved from marginalized citizenship, from second-class citizenship, into the greater American community, were recognized as such, were recognized for being meaningful contributors, and blah, 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 blah. Those rights, unfortunately, the fight for those rights led to the assassination of MLK, and the lynching and hanging and the deaths of, many, and lynching and hanging was prior, but also led to my ability to do what I'm doing now. Okay, so now I've been recognized, and now I'm saying that we're sort of beyond civil rights movement. We're beyond civil rights because my rights have been attained, and it's specifically members of the black community now who are disenfranchising the LGBTI community, and African Americans who recently had their rights acknowledged and rewarded and awarded are now disenfranchising members of the LGBTI community from their recognition of rights. A Spivakian account would say that the assumption that civil rights have been attained because this individual group attained civil rights using a deconstructivist approach, no, they are still members of the American community who have yet to have their rights attained, and because your group, African Americans, have had your civil rights and your civil liberties acknowledged and attained, in no sense affords you the opportunity to disenfranchise others, right? So that the idea is colonialism put into practice mechanisms of mental enslavement. You know, Bob Marley says this, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds. The idea is colonialism via colorism, colonialism via caste systems, the fortification of existing caste systems, colonialism via the fortification of you know, any number of theoretical paradigms, middleman theoretical paradigms where prized peoples were identified and privileged by colonialist establishment. Once colonialists leave, those remnants of colorism remain. Those remnants of sort of racial hierarchy among the colonized remain. Jim Crowism in the United States remains. The idea that we are beyond that, that we freed ourselves from that, is falsified by the fact that members of the community who have now had their rights, this is one example, there's any number of examples, members of the community who have now been quote-unquote liberated from that oppressive system are now themselves imposing systems of oppression, right? So that this idea that we are beyond marginalization is absurd, right? So that's the what, 10-minute sort of synopsis of the grand structure. So don't think that in saying that it's a critique of post-colonialism, that it's an affirmation of colonialism, it would be absurd. It's a critique of post-colonialism as being really a sheep in wolf's clothing. It's attempting many, not all, many post-colonialist theories and many approaches to post-colonial studies presumes to be sort of liberation theory, presumes to be civil rights or, you know, movements against oppression. And what they do is they prize or they privilege a specific community at the disadvantage of others. And the idea is this is exactly the paradigm that was established for colonialism, and thus we are not beyond that, right? We're still sort of fighting that battle, if you will. Okay, so number two, that should make sense to us. So we should all be on the same page, literally and figuratively, in that regard. So number two, there's a denial of getting beyond domination and power. So that it would be interesting to see sort of a conceptual theoretical debate, and for qualitative methodologists, not all of your qualitative methodological study is going to be via participants. Sometimes you're going to do a qualitative approach, you're going to write a qualitative dissertation that's content analysis, and strictly you're just looking at text and you're looking at theoretical paradigms and you're comparing and contrasting that. I think a profound, it needs to be done. If I had the time, I would do it, but I don't have the time. It would be amazing to see Spivak versus Freire, right? I've forever pronounced his name incorrect, despite the fact that I did a whole lecture series and maybe 20 hours of pedagogy of the depressed. But Freire versus Spivak, theoretically, right? Because in a sense, I don't know if we can nicely resolve the liberation theory in Freire and the rather what I believe to be realistic approach in Spivak. Freire tends to me to feel more idealistic in his theoretical disposition. It's not that we undermine, you know, theory has, it's a great, I mean, it's Freire. I mean, the guy's huge, right? He's done amazing work. One of the longest series that I did up until that point was Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It motivated me. I've read it any number of times. because it's just got a good feeling to it, right? But it tends to be a bit idealistic. It tends to believe, it tends to espouse a state of affairs, and I would love for this to be the case. I don't know how it can. I would love for it to be the case. I would love to be wrong. I would love to be disproven, where you arrive at a state where oppressors no longer oppress, and the oppressed no longer want to seek retribution for their oppression. And I just don't know how that can be cognitively correlated with our historical facts, with the truth of human civilization. It might be some truth in the future, maybe, if you're super charitable, not to disrespect Freire's approach. But Spivak's, I'm more Spivakian in this sense. It's like, number 2 says, there is a denial of getting beyond domination and power. There's a denial that we could ever reconcile the absolutist bent inherent within power. Power tends to totalize, right? And it's only those amazing institutions that can recognize that we are totalizing our power and delimit themselves, delimit that propensity towards more control, more domination, that they remain in power. This is the only way to stay in power, is to recognize that you're overextending power. If you think that you're going to stay in power and perpetually overextend the control and the power, the implementation thereof, that's precisely the condition in which you usurp it. But then the next regime comes in and they do exactly the same thing, and this goes on cyclically. There's always going to be some levels of domination and power. Now, I could be wrong, and if you agree more with Freire and not with a more Spivak, and I haven't even fleshed out, we just began, right? But I know Spivak well, but if you believe that this state of mutual recognition, which is empirically verifiable in peace, it can be direct or indirect violence. It could be the absence of conflict. Sure, any way you want to conceptualize this is fine, but the idea is it's got to be quantifiable, right? There has to be a sense in which we're no longer battling and people are no longer dying. I mean, you can't talk about a state where there is no oppression and there is no subjugation, and it doesn't have an empirical referent. No, these people are still marginalized. We believe that there has been a transformation, but listen to the narrative of those who are now recognized by the hegemonic force, and they're espousing the hegemonic system, right? So that the idea is you have the hegemon in place, right? The power structure in place, the status quo, the establishment in place. The hegemon is in a position to impose mechanisms of control. As such, neither good nor bad, right? There are instances in which there are abuses, but just to think that a mechanism of control is in place and it's inherently bad, I don't agree with that. I'm not going to get into sort of the justification. If you watch the Derrida section, you sort of already recognize why, right? The badness, the goodness, the morality, the immorality is collapsed in a deconstructivist approach. It's collapsed in a Nietzschean approach. And there's certain things that need to be done in order to maintain and protect and blah, blah, blah. This is Batman's story, right? So the idea is, yeah, the hegemon imposes mechanisms of control, but it's a gauge. It's always delimiting. Oh, we've extended our power too much. This is not right. Right? We need to reel that back in. Right? Oh well, no. There's a community here, and this community threatens us, and we're going to exercise genocidal campaign against them. I mean, any number of things that can happen. But in opposition to the hegemon is the heterodox community. And the idea is that these states are always in flux. The hegemon becomes the new heterodox, and the heterodox become the new hegemon. And this happens cyclically. It might take a long time, but the idea is as society progresses, there is a propensity, if you're going to remain in power, to diversify power, to become more inclusive, such that you aren't totalizing the marginalization of a community. Because if the marginalization of a community approximates totality, then you instill revolution, right? Revolution is instilled by this. And that's, this is one of the conditions in which nationalism is grounded, sort of this revolutionary bent to nation formation, but it's very, very destructive. It results in civil war. It results in, a complete dismantlement of existing structures, not to mention the loss of life and infrastructure and so on. So that the idea is, in terms of getting beyond the idea, right, the denial, it's academically honest, I think, and very difficult to say that, because it's not a defense of domination. It's not a defense of subordination and subjugation and marginalization. It's not an attempt to preserve that in some sort of sadistic, perverse sense, as much as it is a reference to the historical reality of human existence. And it is in the historical reality of human existence that this is grounded. Now, I don't feel bad in sort of biasing the interpretation, because I've done a 20-hour lecture on Freire's account. So I'm definitely objective. I've argued forcefully for Freire in his account. Now I'm going to argue forcefully for this account, and granted, this is not going to be able to compare in a level of complexity because of time constraints and such. So number 3, Spivak's deconstruction repositions marginality not as a positive space outside of the center, but is constituted within the center, right? And I think I give, I don't go on for the example for a while, so I'll give the explanation. And the explanation that I just gave is good, so I'll explain it again so that you can see sort of mentally what this means. And I hope I'm not going too fast through this, but so let me read this and read it slow. Spivak's deconstruction repositions marginality not as a positive space outside the center. So think of the traditional account. We have the hegemon. The hegemon occupies the center, and we have them, marginalized. The heterodox, outside, marginalized outside. So the hegemon is centralized, conceptually centralized, the locus of power, if you will, is centralized. And what's presupposed here, that it's not stated explicitly, is that the hegemon is identified ethnically, racially, religiously, right? So the hegemon is of a particular religious type, or the hegemon is of a particular ethnical type, or the hegemon is of a particular sexual predisposition, or you get the idea. And everyone else is marginalized outside in terms of exteriority. So this would be the heterodox community, and this is marginalization. And this is a good account, but Spivak is saying that this is not it. It's not to deny. Spivak is not saying that this does not exist. This is more of a Marxist approach, right? So in a sense, this is sort of a traditionalist approach, and Spivak is saying, no, not that, right? Not this. What she's talking about, right, conceptually, and I think the images will help, what she's talking about is we have the hegemon centralized, and within that centralized position, the heterodox is marginalized from within the center, right? You're not excluded from the center. You're part of the center, but you're marginalized from within. So what does that mean? The example that I give, and I might explain this later, would be me. I can explain this well because I live it. This is not to disparage my university at all. I think this would be a problem no matter where I taught. And it's not that I get in any trouble per se here. My students, my evaluations are stellar. I mean, I have very, very good student evaluations. But the truth of the matter is, I'm young, I'm black, I'm tatted to my wrists on both arms, and I'm cocky. I'm not arrogant, but I'm cocky. I know my stuff, and I'm not going to, while I am open to conceding points, and I am obviously a person who's wedded to reason, and I'm open to full concessions, I'm not going to just bow out. If I know that my argument is right, if I know my position is right, I'm not going to allow the institution to tell me that my approach is wrong. So I'll give you an example. So there is, within academia, within the center, within the ivory tower, right now, this is manifested. Of Spivakian, I could use Spivak to make sense of what's happening in academia now. And I'm the new bit. And I'm really rabidly aggressive when it comes to this. In terms of the old model of education, the old model of education is information recall. Right? This is a fact of human civilization. There's no negotiation on this at all. The old model is information recall. So you are taught something and you create a system of memory, regurgitation, rote. It doesn't have to be as basic and simple as rote, but the idea is during test time, it's about recalling information. It's about using the content of what's in your head and nothing other than a number 2 pencil and a Scantron, or a number 2 pencil and a blue book, and taking an exam. That's going to change. That's going to change really soon. That's going to change in the next 10 years. This new approach is, no, I need you to locate the information. So you can imagine students taking new types of tests at a computer and using the computer with internet access to locate information at different sites and different stores. It's almost like an Easter egg hunt, right? Where information is buried in locations and you need to find the information at this particular web address, but we're not going to give you the web address. You need to locate information that's buried here by knowing how to use search terms. It's not about regurgitation. It's not about information recall anymore. Time has changed. The internet makes information recall obsolete. It would be like trying to revisit the 8-track player in the age of iTunes. I mean, it's obsolete. It's obsolete. The fact that I'm saying that now, I know is pissing off a whole lot of people. And I'm not trying to offend the establishment in terms of academia, but you're going to have to give up the reins of power. You're going to give it up or we're going to take it. Because information recall is an old hat. It's about knowing how to locate repositories of information. It's about big data. It's about the storage of information. And my function as an academic is to feed the machine, to feed you, to keep on putting more and more information so that you can access it. You don't got to remember this stuff. Oh, you're smart. Back in my day, smart was what you could recall. Right? Oh, he's smart. Look at all the information. And I'm a last remnant of that old system. Right? It's like, oh yeah, I do have a lot of information in my head. But within academia, the existing sort of hegemonic system, which is still built on information recall, is attempting to marginalize us, this next generation, who pumps information for free out there. And, you know, you'll have meetings. Well, you know, our students are paying a lot. Not, again, to disparage my university. This isn't necessarily an example of my situation. It's just an example in general. But the idea is, in terms of my function, it's not about what my students pay to sit down and listen to me lecture. It's about my obligation as an academic to the system, the institution of education. And the institution of education is changing. The institution of education is no longer going to be about what you can pull up from your head. How many people know the phone numbers I don't know the phone numbers to half the people in my phone. Granted, I don't have a lot of people in my phone, the numbers. But why would I need to recall that information? No, you back that information up on your Google account or your iTunes account. You cloud it. In case my phone is crashed, no problem. You pull that data down and restore that data on the new phone. This just happened to me the other day. Oh my goodness, I lost all my numbers. No, I didn't lose my numbers. They've been clouded. My phone is destroyed. Just get a new phone and you just download that information. Why in the world would I need to memorize all those numbers? When I was a kid, you had to remember all these 7. There's no need for that. You think you get extra brownie points because you can go off and say, oh, I've memorized 50 numbers. Well, good for you. That's complete waste of brain space. You could be using that to solve some problems. Your phone does that now. It's not about information recall. It's about being able to access information. So my function, really, is to put all of this out, to stack as much data out, to put as much information out, to put as much PDFs out and as much information out so that you can do a Google search for a concept, locate my article, click a link for my article, and watch the video informing the information, and oh yeah, I know now. Yeah. Dr. Campbell showed me how to do it. Oh yeah, I got it. I know how to access that. So it's about information access and information accessibility and knowing how to access information, not how to recall. I'm on the other end of information access. I'm an information creator, so I create information to be accessed. But without me, there is no new system. Without you seeking it, there is no new system. So that within this paradigm of the ivory tower, which I am finally, and as a consequence of sheer determination, because it was so hard to get to this point, in the ivory tower. Now that they let me in, now we're going to wreak havoc. Now we're going to wreak havoc. Out with the old system, in with the new. Why? Not because it's about the destruction of the institution as much as it is the institution will collapse if it doesn't get with the times. And the times are millennials aren't trying to have any type of information recall. I don't think any handful of millennials can tell you 10 phone numbers of their closest friends. This would make a great qualitative methodological study. You think this is stupid? Ask, interview, 20-something millennials and ask them, hey, do you have a close relationship with, at least 5 to 10 people that you communicate with regularly? Yes. Of those 5 to 10 people, do you know all their numbers? I guarantee you it's something absurd like 40 or 50%. It might even be higher. No, of course they don't know. If you were to ask my generation or the generation before, of course you remember all the numbers. They could probably still recall the numbers to this day. Right? But the idea is there's no use for that information recall anymore because society has changed. Thus, an educational system that is built on the old model is going to seek to try and preserve the old function, the old order, information recall. And for those of us who are pushing, and I do look at myself as being on the vanguard edge of education, it's a lot of work to do this. It's a tremendous amount of effort on my part, but I believe it has to be done. And I believe and I know that what I've done has motivated other professors. I know this for a fact because I've spoken with them. Has motivated other professors to do their bit. Then this is how the tidal wave is formed, right? So there's going to be an attempt to marginalize those who are pro-information access from those who are pro-information recall because the paradigm is shifting. Information access theorists, me, can do what information recall theorists have done, and they can't do what I can do. Thus, Kuhnian paradigm shift, out with the old, in with the new. It's not a question of if it's going to happen. It's a question of it's happening now, and when it reaches a critical enough mass, we will become, right? My generation, the Gen Xers and the millennial professors and deans and presidents of universities will become the new establishment. And then society will progress and will be challenged by some new model, which isn't even conceptualized yet. Right? And this is the Spivakian account. So it's not so much that, it's not so much that I'm not in the building, I'm in the building. It's not about the marginalization from space. I'm literally in the building. And I'm also figuratively in the ivory tower as sort of a figurative concept. But despite the fact that I'm inside, despite the fact that I'm sort of quote-unquote one of them, and I'm not going to use color, right, because that's too obvious a point. Despite the fact that I'm quote-unquote one of them, my ideological predispositions, my theoretical predispositions are marginalized from the gatekeepers. And it's just a matter of time before the gatekeepers lose their grip. It's just a matter of time. Because either they're going to relinquish their grip or we're going to strong-arm and pry their hands open and take it. And I would expect that this would happen to me years from now, right? There will be a new group of academics who have new theoretical paradigms and new ideological predispositions, and everything that I'm building up now should and will be destroyed, right? It really should be, as it should be. It's not like I don't know this. I know this now, right? And that's the point. Rather than thinking that we're going to arrive at an idealistic state where everybody sits around and we all recognize, no, I recognize all my effort, all my work, everything that I'm laboring for is eventually going to create an institutional monster. It's going to become the new status quo. It's going to become the new establishment. And I know that the next generation will need to dismantle everything that I'm working so hard to build. But I'm going to build a monstrosity and force them to work super hard, 30 years from now to deconstruct what it is I've constructed. But it's this perpetual sort of antagonism. The idea that antagonism is inherently flawed or bad is something that is perversely wrong. There is a good in antagonism. There is a good. There is a moral good in the preservation of antagonism. Right? The idea that all antagonistic relationships should be dissolved into sort of mutual recognition, I think, is perverse. I think it's the most perverse force on the planet, for any number of reasons. So, Spivak's deconstruction repositions marginality not as a positive space outside of the center, but as constituted within the center. So I think my example makes sense of this. Again, if you were just to read this without me contextualizing it and visualizing it and depicting it, it might just be, what in the world is Spivak talking about, right? What is Derrida talking about? What are these guys talking about? Because it seems so sort of paradoxical, but it makes obvious sense. It makes clear sense. And I just gave you an example that wasn't sort of a feminist example, which is simple, or a race example, which I think is extremely simple. It gave you sort of an ideological disposition, right? The attempt to marginalize new ideological modes of interpretation. And as I said, information access is the new thing. Information stockpiling, big data, big pools of, and I trust me, nobody does this more in terms of education and understands this more. Well, people do this more. Khan is huge. He's epic. But there's a lot of us out there. The fact that I can even compare myself to Khan is a testament to me and my work, because that dude's on a whole nother level. But the idea is, no, all of us collectively, whether you have PhDs or not, are contributing to information access, because information access presupposes value positing, or value positors, or information positing, information creators, and that's what I do. I create information to be accessed. It's not me cooking this up, it's me doing the reading, spending, a month, constructing the notes, and then the time to shoot it, and all. It's insane that I even do this. It really is. But this is where education's going, and if I can put in my 2 cents to aid in this next wave, then when I'm old and gray, I'll look back and be like, I helped build that. That's me. And now here comes the new legion of bastards to destroy my work. But they should do it. Okay, so top of page 6. Let me make sure I did that right. Yeah, top of page 6. This is A. Oh, sorry, top of page 8. Apologize. Top of page 8. The qualitative application. The lack of respect felt by minority professionals marginalized from within. Right, so I gave, because the Routledge text used feminism. And the idea is, just to contextualize the reading, if you end up reading the book yourself, the idea was the authors interviewed a new, young, fledgling PhD. She graduates, she has a PhD, but she feels marginalized insofar as within the ivory tower, the hegemonic force is a Euro-Western-centric, masculine, heterosexual narrative. Christian, probably. No, maybe not Christian, but it's probably, in academia, it's more maybe secularist, humanist, secularist predisposition. Which even leads me to a quick side note, right? The narrative in the the hegemonic narrative might also be Christian, anti-Christian. It might be, this is arguable, this is contestable, but it just popped in my head, so I'm going to say it. It might be the case that human secularism within the intelligentsia is what's being defended, and what's being excluded is sort of Islamic or Christian or faith-based beliefs. And you'll see any number of these happening, for just or unjust, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really interested in that. And the idea, another good qualitative methodology would be to defend or reacclimate that back into the educational paradigm. I think it would be a mission. It would be quite the task to do that, given where we are socially, and some of the exclusionary practices that are justified by any number of religious beliefs. But there might be a way to, have a middle ground. It might not be as all or none as that, but you get the idea. So the example in the text is the marginalization from within as a member of the ivory tower and the intelligentsia, a woman being marginalized. You can imagine that African American could be marginalized. I don't feel that in terms of my own personal experience. I don't feel my race at all in the university. I'm respected by my peers, so I don't feel that. What I do feel isn't race. I feel my ideological sort of beliefs, my theoretical predispositions. I can definitely sense that tension. I definitely sense that all the time. Right? It's like, all these video lectures, like, why are you doing that? That's one of the first things when I started putting up video lectures, even from the general public, people couldn't understand. Like, why? What's your motivation? Why are you doing this? There has to be something insidious behind all of this work. You're not just doing this. What's the cause? The cause is, 3 years ago, I saw that education was changing, and I decided to aid in that change. And fortunately, I've done so much work that it's going to be impossible for, anyone to sort of, not that I'm in a competition, but it's going to be impossible for anyone to sort of catch up with the amount of work that I've amassed, because I just don't stop amassing it. So, we have specializations. Okay, you want philosophy, that's sort of micro lectures, detailed overkill, come to me. You want philosophy that's more general, bite-sized, go to that guy. You want another guy who does more ethics and that, go to this dude, right? So you, as the educational consumer, have at your disposal any number of avenues for your education, and that you determine how this is the idea of sort of education a la carte, right? And that's where it's going. It's education a la carte. It's everything a la carte. Flying a la carte, everything's a la carte, right? It's a mix and match, and my idea is, yeah, there are other alternatives, but I'm not serving people who have a taste for the bite size. If you want a taste for the bite size and the quick, sort of neat and tidy, go watch that other dude's videos. Not to disparage him or her, but I don't do that. Here, I serve those who are looking for a full meal. So I serve those who have the patience to sit through 20, 30, 50, 60 hours of lecture in order to get satisfaction. And the bastards who watch my videos, these ravenous heathens, they're never satisfied, So anyway, shout out to the perpetual hunger. Anyway, moving along. So number 4, page 8. So this is important, right? It is impossible to say a full no to a structure that creates the very life that we have. I'll explain that, sounds vague. And it follows that resistance and critique are never transcendent, but rest inside the middle of things, right? The idea is, in terms of, I'm going to sort of demonstrate this. The idea is that, in terms of, this is 4, it is impossible to say a full no to a structure that creates the very life that we have, right? Now, we're not talking obviously here about the biological life, but in terms of education, because this is a good example. There are any number of examples, but in terms of education, the condition in which we arrive at understanding is contingent on informational exchange. That informational exchange leads to, it creates a condition for novel, new interpretive modes. And those new novel interpretive modes are the things that scientists pick up and to see, hey, can we operationalize this in science? This is the thing that cultural theorists pick up and see, can we operationalize this in marketing, in advertising? The idea is social science, the way I view social science, and the way I view what we do as qualitative methodologists is, I view us as the catalyst for society, right? We are the ones who put out the ideas, we are the ones who put out the theories, we are the ones who make the speculations, we justify them logically and such, we justify them socio-historically and such. We put it out there to be contemplated, to be deliberated, and then everybody sort of feeds on our work, right? So I put stuff out there, and government populations say, hey, let's work with that. I put stuff out there, and educational institutions say, hey, we could operationalize that. I put stuff out there, and business communities say, hey, we could use that, semiotics in our marketing, da-da-da. The idea is, as social science and social scientists, we recognize as a consequence of social construction theory that we are the creators. We create information, and it's from these ideas, which have been justified and legitimized, that others can feed and create power for themselves, money for themselves, reputation for themselves, control for themselves, or wherein the population who's been marginalized and exploited can fight for recognition, can fight for power. But the idea that we're going to create a state of affairs, and this is absolutely critical, but the idea that we are going to create a state of affairs wherein that state of affairs nullifies all antagonisms is preposterous. It's hubris. It's not going to happen. Why? Because we don't have epistemic control of other people's actions. No. I don't care what you do. There's going to be someone that's going to hold an antithetical position if it's just to be an ideological dogmatist. just to be freaking antagonistic for no other purpose than being antagonistic. There are those types of people in the world. So the idea that we're going to, as social scientists, create a state of affairs, and once we articulate it, then there will be totalizing peace, yeah, then we arrive in an idealistic state, is fiendishly perverse, right? So, so the idea is we're not talking about overcoming. We're not talking about liberation as ontological reality. We're not talking about liberation as an ontological reality, as manifest as such, having been liberated, and thus, egalitarianism and equality and equity as such. We're talking about instances of equity, instances of egalitarian recognition, instances of mutual cooperation, mutual cohabitation, not a totalized equity, a totalized egalitarian recognition and such, right? No, never that, never that. So, qualitative application, professional minorities, sort of the irreverence of the professional minority, right? I recognize that I am seen as this, and yeah, I'm going to be the professor who does a rap on YouTube in a beater, and you're just going to have to live with that. I'm okay with you not feeling comfortable with that. Your discomfort is not going to dissuade me and get me into the leather jacket with the elbow pads. Even though one of these days I am probably going to rock, just for fun, the jacket with the elbow pads. Put on some penny loafers and really look the part. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, though, right? I still got a lot of fight in this dog. So yeah, that's the idea, sort of irreverence. That's one approach. If I'm already marginalized, and that's what I meant to draw. If we're within the center, and we have marginalization within the center, right? If we have marginalization within the center, you recognize that it's in response to this marginalization from the center, right? And this doesn't necessarily have to be a feminist marginalization or a race-based marginalization. It could be theoretical marginalization or ideological marginalization, which I feel more. I definitely feel a ton of antagonism. I feel it strong. You get it from the editors, right? They want it to be socio-historically based because that's the old model, and if it's not reference to history, then we're not so likely to publish your stuff. You sense this in terms of sort of video lectures, right? Well, video lectures aren't as meaningful, right? Because the real education happens in the classroom, and the stuff that you do on the internet, because there isn't any feedback, isn't as good. Then we respond irreverently, right? So that marginalization is responded to in part by, now this is not Spivak, this part is me. There's many other ways to respond to marginalization, but I choose to respond to marginalization with irreverence. I don't care about your old system. I don't care about what power you think you have. When we're talking about this system, when we're talking about this institution, I'm already inside. We are already inside. We're not asking for recognition. This is no negotiation. We're not asking. We're informing you that we're here, and we are going to determine how this institution evolves. And there is absolutely nothing that you can do about it. There's nothing. So, conform, placate us, adapt, or get steamrolled over, because it's a matter of chronological time before we become the new deans, we become the new presidents, we become the new editors, we become the new reviewers of journals, we become the new book publishers. It's our time. And this generation of academics is raised on YouTube. It's raised on immersive, interactive, self-directed education. It's not the old model. And once we are enough, once we reach critical mass, we determine how this is going to look. So it's not a question. We're not asking for favors. We're not asking for handouts. We want to be recognized as equals, and if not, steamroll. That's how it's going to go down, I'm trying to tell you. I'm trying to tell you. This is the new face. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's good for you. It's good for your kids. It's good for the generation. There will come a point at which we become too dogmatic. It's not now, because we're fighting for power. It will come a time at which our collective power is too rigid. And I'm smart enough to make sure that once I get there, I'm not even close to getting there yet, but once I get there, that I will encourage others to destabilize the very thing that I helped to create. But the idea is irreverence is a good thing. The fact that I won't be tamed, I won't bow, I won't be humbled, I will be acknowledged, I will, not me, Jason, per se, but us as academics, us as theorists, right? This qualitative methodological approach is less about the participant and more about us as researchers. This is about us as researchers. This is defending our way of interpreting the world, our modality of accessing information as opposed to sort of regurgitating information. It's about this new change and the power that the power of information provided by accessing it on the net. That's what it's about. So if they don't get, and trust me, I'm not going to get into personal stories, you have no idea the level of resistance. You have no idea. Why? Because you can imagine you have the new young professor who on a scale of 5 has, you know, very, very high ratings, 4.5, 4.7, 4.8 ratings, who can access information globally and give information globally, and that information feeds to his superiors. You can imagine that people who aren't so inclined, tech savvy, are going to be a little envious, right? That they're going to be a little resentful. And this is normal. This is normal. This is not to disparage, and I'm not necessarily talking about my colleagues, but you can imagine that this would be the case. The reason why I do this is that I don't want to do something as cliche, even though it's true, cliched is sort of race and feminism, right? And not to disparage either race or feminist accounts, but they're rather obvious accounts of marginalization from within the center. I want to use Spivak to talk about exactly her concept, marginalization from within the center, but show you that we, researchers, can feel marginalization despite the fact of having made it because we aren't ideologically attuned to the old guard, because our theoretical and our educational paradigms aren't in alignment with the old system. And the idea is, don't change. Don't change. You're not doing yourself any service if you conform. Be irreverent in response to that attempt to keep us in place and refuse to upload more videos, write more lectures for the global society. And who likes it, who doesn't. Because at the end of the day, this is where the system goes. And I want to be on the side of progress, not regress. And that's the way that this goes. At the end of the day, right now it's hard, but 20 years I'll look back and be like, I was on the right side of this. I chose the right side, and I fought the good fight, despite the fact that today it's difficult. Looking back, I know I'm on the right side of history, so I just know I am. So that's that. Huge stuff, right? So the idea, this is not just about qualitative methodologies, isn't just about sort of data interpretation, it's not just about the research participant, it's not just about theoretical sort of predispositions, it's also about us. It's about us, researchers, and we're a weird group, right? Because we're a bunch of freaking loners. We're a bunch of loners. We sit up in the libraries by ourselves. We love drinking our tea and our coffee. We like solitude and quiet. We like being in the recesses. We don't communicate well with others. We don't play well with others. But we're good people. So I feel your pain. Trust me, I feel your pain. If you're low, I feel your pain. But recognize that despite the fact that you can't sense the community, there is a community here, right? There is a community, and I'm shedding blood with you. You know, I'm shedding blood with you. I'm putting in the work with you. So don't be discouraged. All right. So 4B, irreverence is a condition for power, for transference, for transformation. I just explained that. Tendency to buckle under assimilationist pressure. Don't do that, right? Don't buckle from the center. If you made it to the center, why I mean, the fact that we're here, right? And it doesn't just need to be academia, right? You can think of one of the key problems that I think might, and I swore I wasn't going to do any more criminal justice stuff, but it came into my head, so I'll switch paradigms here. So in criminal justice theory, you know, sort of good cop, bad cop. It's primarily been the case that African Americans who serve the public as police officers, they have a marginalized role from within the center. Within their community, who is marginalized, right? So the community of marginalized people, they're viewed as the oppressor. They're viewed as, oh, you're an Uncle Tom, you're a cop. A black cop is probably the worst thing that you can be. It's definitely worse than a white cop. You expect it from a white cop. You see a black cop, you're like, look at this house nigger. Pardon my French, but look at this house nigger. Look at this Uncle Tom, right? Be the police out of shit, I'm trying to think of Fuck the Police from Ice Cube. I forget, I would have to sort of recite the whole thing, I don't have it the time to recite the whole thing. But Ice Cube in Fuck the Police says, and I say police because he says police, I know it's pronounced police, but so Ice Cube says in Fuck the Police something about black cops, right? So we have a cultural reference, and the idea is if you're a black cop patrolling a black community, you recognize that the community doesn't see you as being black when you're in the blue. When you're decked down head to toe in blues, you're one of them. So then you go back to the precinct, and your colleagues in the precinct see you as one of them. So you're in this very precarious, marginalized from within the center. So you could use Spivak to talk about centrist marginalization in terms of criminal justice. I'll give one last example so that you can see this. You can imagine that hospital administration and nursing, right? Nurse administrators, I would assume, are primarily female in sex, women in terms of gender, right? So it's probably a lot of women, not to be pejorative, just as a statistical fact. And you could recognize that there might be marginalization is within the community of women in nursing administration if the nurse administrator is a man, right? Men are not represented or are underrepresented within nursing administration, or hospital administration, and so I'm already marginalized as in terms of being a man. Men look at, if you say, they have a whole, I think Meet the Fockers, there's a whole skit on the absurdity of this dude being, I feel like it's Meet the Fockers, where it's like you're a female nurse, like what is that, you're a male nurse, like what does that mean, like you're a male nurse? Obviously the implication is that you're homosexual. It has nothing to do with your predisposition to sexuality, but our society is such constructed that to be a male nurse, alright, so you're already marginalized as saying that you're a male nurse. And then in the center, around women, you're marginalized yet again because you're not like them. So there is this, the genius of Spivak is the recognition of this marginalization from the center. You see, I just given you 3 examples, how you can use this theoretical concept to account for centrist marginalization. It would be an existential, not phenomenological. It could be phenomenological, but it'd probably be better suited for existentialist qualitative methodologies or narrative qualitative methodologies. Dr. Campbell, give me your story. I have a story to tell, I just told you. Give me your story of ideological, theoretical marginalization despite the fact that you're in the ivory tower. I just gave it to you, right? And you hear other narratives like that. There is good substantial qualitative methodological accounts that can be built on this realization of centrist marginalization, and it's wholly indebted to Spivak's just genius, right? For BI, and then I'll break and then pick up with 5. This is me now. A reverence is a condition for power, transference, transformation, I explained that. Tendency to buckle under assimilationist pressures. In-group, out-group dichotomies. Power in finding comfort in the out-group. As I said in the last section on Derrida and the deconstructivist account, I recognize that the discomfort that might be experienced, rather than falling victim to the discomfort, to the dissatisfaction, to the fact that, I might not be liked among my peers, which I'm not saying is necessarily the case. And some people might envy my ability or might just hate, haters. Haters are going to hate. I'm not going to let that dissuade me. I use that discomfort as an indication that I'm doing something right. I use that discomfort as an indication, as an opportunity to transform the educational system by doing hundreds of hours of this, by spending equal hundreds of hours. Probably if I do hundreds of hours of video, I do thousands of hours of reading and note-taking. Trust me, this looks simple. This is not easy to put together. Why? Because now you can access information quicker. Oh yeah, he has the page numbers here. That's cool. He cited it. So I can actually read the book, formulate my own interpretation, look at his notes, watch his video, get an alternative interpretation, check his interpretation of that same thing that I just read against my interpretation of what I just read, and formulate yet another interpretation. I mean, come on. This is the new thing. Until technology advances some new ability, this is the new thing. And, I'm just keep fighting this fight. So the idea is finding comfort in the out group, right? Not asking for recognition and recognizing that this is going to be, it's going to be an uphill battle. But being uncomfortable that's part of the job description, right? If you're not built for it, you shouldn't be in this field. And the idea is those people who excel are those people who aren't going to change no matter what, right? No matter what, there is no changing. It's too late for that. So I'm going to pause here, pick up with 5, and then continue with section 1.3. Okay, number 5, direct quote, this is number 5 on page 8. Structures themselves are not as stable as they appear, yet they do define and regulate people's way of life. So here's the application of this, and this is me. By implication, resistance from within structures of power, is genuinely a struggle or the mode of the social regulation of people's lives, which is why there is no genuine post-colonial. If you think about this, the colonial modality was such that centrist structures of power, let's just use Britain, and not to disparage Britain, but just, let's just use Britain as the canonical example. The sun never set on Britain. So let's use Britain as the colonial force. You recognize that the way in which colonial force established itself was in the act of colonization. Part of the act of colonization was the exportation of violence, as an example. And despite the liberation and the independence of all these disparate national communities having, quote-unquote, freed themselves from British rule, having freed themselves from British violence and British control, these communities then, having attained freedom, having attained independence, institute precisely the same mechanisms. They institute and they reify their power by exporting violence, by exporting systems of control, by checking those who would otherwise seek to usurp their power. And they presuppose that they're beyond a colonialist mentality, and this is what Spivak is calling them foul law. No, you're lying. No. Don't delude yourself to believe that you could possibly talk about nationalist ideology, to get technical now, I don't want to get too technical here, but don't think that you could talk about a nationalist ideology that exists independent of systems of structured, intentful control. Don't think that you can talk about it's not just shame on Britain, right? It's not just the Brits are the only forces. No. I mean, at the time, of course, it was reprehensible. Of course, what happened, we're not justifying what happened, but the idea that it's solely the Brits who are going to be defamed forever it's absurd. Everybody does this. Every single nation on this planet is in this game. And the idea to think that you're not in this game is ludicrous. Similarly, in academia, we're doing exactly the same thing. In academia, we're doing exactly the same thing as what's happening on a national level, at an international level. We academics have our theoretical predispositions, so you might have been encultured to regard German idealism as the system for explanation. You might have become a positivist and have a positivist sort of interpretive theoretical framework. You might be an idealist or a reductive physicalist, and you call yourself by these labels. I refuse to call myself by any of these labels. I'm a scholar, period. And I'm not knocking scholars who call themselves, I'm a Marxist, I'm a neo-Marxist, I'm a neoclassicist, I'm a this, I'm a that. Okay, that's not a problem. I get it. I understand. The idea is, however, in terms of being post-colonial, this specific label for Spivak is problematic. Because to say that my theoretical, and I want to make sure that this is clear, to say that my theoretical predisposition is such that what I espouse is antithetical to colonialist ideological domination, mental domination, not physical violence, but mental domination. The very fact that I articulate a position, the very fact that I espouse theoretical systems of belief necessitate that I am not talking about some other group, right? So, African American studies. I'm talking about African American studies. Clearly, I have to specialize. I can't talk about everything. So I'm talking about African American studies. I'm talking about the historical narrative with which African American identity went from being demonized to at least partially recognized. I spend my life on that. Just as great work. A lot of huge names in this field. That's great. A lot of huge names in this field who would self-identify as post-colonialists, which is fine. I don't particularly have a problem with that at all. What Spivak is saying is not shame on you, you're a fraud, as much as it is a recognition of humility. Remember that you now are part of the intelligentsia. You're at Harvard, you're at Yale, you're at Princeton, you're at maybe just, University, State University X. And you have students now that you teach about African American history and that you teach about African American recognition. And also remember that there is a new fight for recognition in the LGBTI community. If you both hold a post-colonialist position, now that I think about it, it's a very technical argument, right? If you both hold a post-colonialist position, theoretically, in defense of African American identity, and, as a conjunction, and you are against the LGBTI movement, recognize your contradiction. Recognize the falsity of everything that you stand for. And if you disagree with Spivak, then the obligation and the burden of proof is in your court. How can you both argue for a post-colonialist identification of black identity and also be anti-LGBTI rights? I don't see how you can do that. I would agree with Spivak in this sense. I think it's hypocritical because you used to be, and your entire career is built on the fight for identity, the fight for recognition, the fight for inclusion, the fight for humanization, the recognition that I am just like you, I bleed just like you, I love just like you, I have desires and hopes just like you. And now you get a big check and you want to deny the LGBTI movement because you happen to be heterosexual? Well, what are you doing then? You are operationalizing discrimination based on heterosexual normativity. And thus you are part of the system of oppression and domination. That's the game. That's the game. And if not, then there needs to be a justification for why not, right? If that's not the case, and you refuse to believe that, then articulate your position. I'm a theorist. I'm not wedded to anything. But there needs to be the thesis. She creates the new thesis. If you disagree with that, and you believe that sort of this centrist marginalization is a crock, the burden of proof is on you to argue against this. Why is it a crock? Why isn't this an accurate articulation? To date, I haven't read a good sort of response to Spivak. And, if you don't agree with Spivak, then write, I wouldn't say a treatise, but write an article or write a publication explaining why this is all wrong. It would be interesting to see the interpretation because I believe this is all right. Her interpretation, I believe, is right, but it could be destabilized by a new interpretive model. I don't have that in my power because I agree with her, but it'd be interesting to hear that, right? So that the idea is, it's always going to be a struggle. There's always going to be the attempt for social recognition, which is why there's no genuine post-colonial. So 5A, preservation of systems and structures of varying degrees of oppression, suppression, etc. are in place, and those in place will seek to preserve their power. Those who are disenfranchised from power will seek to usurp those who are in control. And it is a cyclical process. It's not to deny the plausibility, or the possibility maybe more so, the possibility of a Fourierist state, but I would say to be the most charitable that I could give, that I could be to Fourier, is to say that it would be sort of instances, dispersed instances of recognition. So South African apartheid could be and was successfully usurped by Mandela's nonviolent, primarily nonviolent, mostly nonviolent movement, and a lot of good came from that. Again, he was on the right side of history in his actions, right? And the amount of respect that he was given at his funeral is probably the greatest honor a person could get. You have presidents from all over the globe flying in to to spend and to spend time and pay respects to this man is just, I mean, it's, you know, that says a lot. That means a lot. Do you think that Mandela was naive enough to believe that he had reconciled racism in South Africa? Of course not. Of course not. That's absolutely ludicrous. He never believed that. He couldn't have believed that. It exists today. It's alive and well today. But the idea is he made his contributions and he fought his fight. He selected one thing that he was going to fight, and he spent his whole life fighting that, and he won that battle. Right? The war is forever. But you can win a battle. You can. You really can. And I know that sounds so bad, the war is forever. That sounds that sounds terrible. Especially, oh, I'm going to get to that. That's a side note. Anyway, number 6, qualitative application. So under a deconstructivist account, good qualitative analysis might seek to identify how academics compromise their original idealist sentiments. And you better believe I was an idealist, right? I definitely was. And it's not like I've been disheartened by it. I just got better. I realized that my previous idealistic predispositions are irrelevant. And the game is negotiating with power, or fighting for power, or usurping power, or defending power. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to, if you sort of arrive, if you finally gain access to the center, you're going to have to deal with power one way or the other. There's in any institution, in anything, you're going to deal with it. And it's going to absorb you, or you're going to transfer it or transform it, but there's no getting around power in all of its abstractions. And you could do a lecture series on just what that means, because it is a bit amorphous in terms of the application. But you're going to have to relinquish some of that idealistic predisposition. And I tell my graduate students this all the time. Look, it's not about manifesting a change in the world that's empirically verifiable just like that. I mean, think about the struggle that Mandela went through. The overwhelming majority of people in the world, much less in a country, will never approximate the battle and the amount of effort and endurance that took him to finally usurp the system of oppression. And he was able to make that change, but that's why he's Mandela. What we can do is we can make incremental change. So don't think that the efforts that and don't be dissuaded by the fact that your efforts, my efforts, might not readily manifest themselves within my lifetime at the level of a Mandela, or at the level of a MLK, or at the level of a Gandhi. The idea is it's incremental, right? It's incremental, and incremental progress is good. So original idealist sentiments for social change: to become fabricators of systems of exceptionalism, domination, exclusion, and even how they might justify this perspectival change. So what does this really mean? The idea is, this would be more difficult to find. It's more anthropological research in a sense, but you can imagine that there are former heads of regimes anywhere in the world, and they were at a time in control of political power, and they abused the power. As a matter of fact, I've seen documentaries on genocidal regimes in Cambodia, and not so much the leaders of the regimes, but the henchmen for the regimes. And, you know, they did mass atrocities and killed hundreds of people. And in terms of truth and reconciliation and such, activists are locating these henchmen, these perpetrators of violence. And the idea is power was in possession, if you will, figuratively, right? Power was occupied, and now it's completely lost. And the idea is, it would be an amazing, and trust me, you could probably get funding. You could probably get a lot of funding for this, now that I think about it. I'm sure your government, this government, any government would fund this type of qualitative research. Don't think it's just quantitative. I think this would be a great qualitative research. Is tell me about the instances when you recognized that you were losing power. Why would a government want to fund that? Because they want not to do what they did. I want to make sure that I never do what these guys did, because you failed miserably. And I'm trying to maintain power. You think a government's not going to fund your research? They're going to throw cash at you. They're going to throw, I mean, it would have to be a substantial qualitative research, maybe multi-year. That would be, I mean, even me, now I think about it, I probably shouldn't have said that publicly. That's something I would get on. That would be a huge qualitative analysis. Multinational, multi-country, multi-language. Obviously, it would be conducted in multiple languages. The one key constituent point criteria would be individuals who are qualitative, in terms of qualitative methodologies, individuals who are selected, participants who are selected, would have had to have been in power for a time and have lost power and now are civilians, quote unquote. And to have them recount how they lost power. Oh my goodness, can you imagine? You have an N of like 250. I mean, an N of 250 qualitative would be ridiculous. Say an N of 100 of people who were in power, lost power, and you sort of do pattern analysis and maybe a grounded theory on that. Oh my goodness, insane research. I just gave you the gem of all gems. Now this might actually be too big for, I don't think any one, I know for a fact, no one individual could do this. I know that. I'm not tooting my own horn, but it's just genius. So if you like that, please give me a shout out. Start a consortium, right, and do that as a mission. And start an NGO and operationalize that as a mission, right? It would be multinational, multi-language based with the same paradigm. It'd be great. Why? Because it would improve global political governance, not government. It would operationalize sort of a best practices, a how-to, right? This is what they did that was bad. It doesn't have to be as obvious as killing people and genocide, right? It doesn't have to be that. Maybe things change and times change and we are no longer in power because of, any number of things. You can think of McCarthyism in the States, right? Sort of the witch hunt, right? That witch hunt mentality, it undermines itself. And we don't refer favorably when we evoke McCarthyists or McCarthyism in the U.S. No one died per se, maybe off-grid people did, but no one died from sort of the witch hunt. But those who were in place to operationalize the witch hunt are viewed, historically speaking, as being on the wrong side of history. And they're demonized, as they should be. So that the idea is, it doesn't always have to be sort of this sort of killing, mass extermination. No, it could be a witch hunt, right? It could be something as seemingly pedestrian as that. The idea is, though, you're on the wrong side of history, right? You really are, right? Because you're excluding, you're abusing power, and history is going to look disparagingly on you, and nobody wants to have their name tarnished. But at the end of the day, it's me and my ilk that tell the narrative. It's the academics and the historians that determine the truth of a presidency, the truth of the nation, the truth. It's the historians, it's the writers, it's the academics. We determine how that interpretation is formed. And if you're exploiting the power that you have in order to exercise a witch hunt, you're going to be on the wrong side of history, right? So I think that's important, right? So our representing the margins. This is a good quote, right? So, quote, this is the bottom of page 8, the valorization of marginality in the universities, such that there is an overzealous drive to locate, represent, and inhabit the margins, is about as bad as it gets. Everyone's interested in, Spivak does talk about subalternity. Just a quick side note, I'm not going to qualify it, so this might not make sense to a lot of the viewers, and I apologize. For those of you who are more advanced, you'll understand, because I just don't have the time to qualify. But in terms of a Spivakian approach, marginalization and oppression are not synonymous with subalternity. Subalternity is an aspect of marginalization. But to talk about marginalization is not to talk about subalternity, right? So there are instances of marginalization that are not subaltern. But there is no instance of subalternity that isn't an instance of marginalization, right? Very technical. What does that look like? I'll draw a picture. The picture is this. Academics sort of overemphasize marginalization and subalternity, and you undermine the efficacy of subalternity and marginalization studies if everything is marginalized and everything is subaltern, and it's not the case. Subalternity is, which I'm not going to discuss now, is a much, much more impoverished state. So that if we have marginalization here as a set, we have subalternity as a subset of the set of marginalization. So all instances of subalternity are within marginalization. All instances of subalternity are within marginalization, but not all instances of marginalization are within subalternity. So you can be marginalized without being subalterned, but you cannot be subalterned without being marginalized, right? That's the sort of the Venn relationship. And it's important to recognize this. Why? Because everyone isn't, there is marginalization, and marginalization does exist, but in terms of subaltern studies, every group is not subalterned, right? Why? All subalternity is built on marginalization, but there are instances of marginalization that are not subaltern. And this is just a good, simple visual description so that you don't confuse it. You can imagine that if you were to write this out and send it to the old guard editors, they might not understand, but their lack, and I'm not disparaging the editors, I'm being facetious here, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but their lack of understanding isn't my problem, right? The idea is, it sounds difficult, but the visual representation is rather simple, and it is what Spivak has espoused repeatedly. She is repeatedly, I've watched videos of her discussing this concept. I wouldn't say she's a bit annoyed, but it's a sign of intellectual sort of impoverishment to assume that by talking about marginalization, we're also already talking about subaltern studies. We're not. You cannot do subaltern studies without talking about marginalization, but you can do marginalization studies without doing subalternity. And unfortunately, a lot of people are just, this is the new margin, this is the new marginalized group, this is the new marginalized group. Why? Because, I hate to say this, the existing educational system, which is built on tenure, which is neither here nor there, it rewards journal publication and review and blah, blah, blah. And there tends to be, it's the traditional supply-demand model. There is a demand in the population for discussions on sort of liberal theorists and liberal articulations of marginalized communities. So you recognize that you can get tenure by talking about marginalized studies, and everybody does it because everybody's in the chase for tenure. Of course, that's completely to disparage what's going on, and it's a gross generalization. I recognize that, and it's an oversimplification by far. But the truth of the matter is, as the quote says, the valorization, this is not just me, this is what the text says, the valorization of marginality in universities, they don't tell you why it's valorized in the universities, it's valorized in the universities for tenure. It's valorized in the university to safeguard that check, to safeguard those amazing benefits and that amazing health coverage. It's valorized in the university because if I talk about marginalization and marginality, I keep my job. That's why it's valorized, right? It's supply-demand. People want to hear it. You can hold big conferences to talk about the marginalization of X community. And what do theorists do? You find marginalization where it might not even exist, right? It becomes problematic. I do like the conservative critique. That's why I never discard conservatism in any sense, right? There, you need that gauge, right? Liberals, sometimes you guys get a little carried away, right? There's oppression everywhere. There's marginalization everywhere. The man is to blame for everything. I mean, there might be some truth to that, and I don't want to. This is why I have no friends in academia. This is precisely why I have no friends, because I'm wedded to the truth. I mean, there is some truth to, okay, enough. Everything isn't marginalized. Every community isn't marginalized, right? It's not all bad. So the valorization of marginality in university, such that there is an overzealous drive to locate, represent, and inhabit the margins. What's not left there, what's left out there, is a consequence, in part, of the hunt for tenure. As pathetic as it is, it's true. So page 40, qualitative application. Good possible meta-analysis, the analysis of the analysis, a good possible meta-analysis of this. It is rarer for a graduate student to attempt a meta-analysis, an analysis of an analysis. The overrepresentation of marginality in academia is a good meta-analysis. Top of page 9. Conditions that might have influenced this trend. What are the conditions? As I said, tenure, obviously. So here's the question. Has academic research become a product for consumers? And I've told you that I believe it is. It'd be good via Spivak. It'd be good for you to critique and say, no, Dr. Campbell, you're wrong. It hasn't. I believe it has been. I think a lot of the old model is built on sort of this mass consumption of bits of information that's published in esoteric journals that a handful of people read, that looks good on a CV line, that talk about the revolution or the liberation of an oppressed group, and conferences are held, and no one's really in the streets doing it, and no one's really doing this, and there isn't much other than what Freire would call a lot of armchair revolutionaries. Not to disparage, but none of this is me. I just read the quote, I explained the quote, and I told you a phrase that comes out of Freire. None of this is me. I've synthesized it all. But don't think that, oh, Dr. Campbell this is him and he's irreverent, too irreverent. This is me just explaining facts. You might not like facts, but this is the facts. Freire calls it armchair revolutionary. So it's a whole bunch of armchair revolutionaries cashing a check. A lot of the old educational system is built on armchair revolutionaries cashing a check. So you got a nice comfy position, you got your tenure, you published your one little article from the 80s, you haven't done anything, you're not part of any social movements, you're not with the people, but you're talking about marginalization because it bolsters your position. That's the situation. So has academic research become a product for consumers? Possibly yes. It will continue to be a product for consumers, but I think it will be a different type of product. It won't be so maniacally bad because of this sort of education a la carte. This idea of specialization. The idea that we all don't have to be talking about the same narrative, right? God forbid you're a black guy teaching in academia and you don't do African American history. God forbid you're a woman who has a PhD and you're not specializing in feminist theory. Right now I'm a black guy who does not do race theory. I'm going to do a series on race. I'm going to upload that as my social contribution to the world. And then I'm going to bow out from that. That's not my field. I'm not interested in that field. I'm really not. You know, I think it's important. I think it's meaningful. It's just not my calling. And the idea that because I'm black, I have to do race theory is about as totalizing and just perversely wrong as possible. Because a woman is a PhD social scientist scholar, and she has to do feminist theory, or else she isn't legitimized as a theorist, is unfair. No, do whatever you want to do, right? Me, I do conflict resolution, international conflict, warfare, all that stuff. That's what I do. That's what I do. That's the only thing I'm interested in, and I'm not interested in anything else. And I never will be interested in anything else until the day that I die. All of this is for the social good. None of this really, unfortunately or fortunately, very little of this informs what I actually do, what I'm actually interested in, what I'm actively writing on. I write on something completely different from this stuff. But in some sense, you know, giving these lectures do give me ideas, so it's good for me to sort of data mine my own information. And there is a sense in which there is a commodity, there is a product at stake, but I'm not defending anything, right? And I'm also not defending my position because my university doesn't have tenure. It doesn't. I'm going to have to compete until the day that I die, and I think that's going to make me really strong. Right? I don't want to become content. I don't want to have a sense that everything's good. I want to be able, you know, there comes a point at which you've earned, and not to disparage tenure, there are professors, obviously, who've earned their tenure, right? They've put in their work. You arrive at a point in your life where you can sort of sit back and not have to fight. I'm not going to be able to fight this fight forever just because of age. And just, you know, what happens with age and time in your mind. But while I'm young, no break. While I'm young, no break. When I get older, I'll let the young guys come. They can take shots. It'll be a hard fight for them, right? Because while I was young, now I'm in it. In terms of the motivation, though, I don't feel like I'm definitely not doing this for money. There's no money to be had here. I'm doing this for the next generation, right? I'm technically undermining my own power by doing this, but it doesn't really matter. I know this. And actually I'm not. I'm extending it. I'm contributing to the next instantiation of power. Marginality is a consequence of the demand for academic literature on the topic, rather than a product of this social obligation to overcome oppression, right? There's one sense in which inauthentically you can espouse post-colonialist ideologies, and the espousal does not manifest in, I mean, post-colonial theory is about the forceful, I mean, think Fanon, right? It's about overcoming oppression. You got to take to the streets to do that. You got to get active to do that. You have to mobilize to do that. Don't think that you're doing that because you published a journal article. You just published a journal article. That's really all that you did, right? The idea is publish that journal article, and then after you've published that journal article, go out there and help contribute to a new social movement. Instill and invite and excite students and others to operationalize what you've said. Give it away to the public for free and say, hey, here's a model I think could work. Use it and operationalize it because you know you're not going to go out and do it. But don't just think it's tucked tidy in a journal on some shelf that no one can access, that has any significance in the 21st century. It has no power. There's no power in that at all in 21st century academia. You got to make it available. You have to make it accessible, or otherwise it doesn't exist. Number 2, middle of page 9, the minority professional as representative inhabits neither the center nor the margins. And I explained that earlier. 2a, there is an as yet to be described phenomenon that is this experience. I explained my own sort of embodiment in this, not in terms of my quote-unquote race being black. I don't feel marginalized from being a black guy at the institution in any sense. I never feel that. But I do ideologically feel and sort of generationally feel marginalized. Not by my colleagues or the institution per se, but obviously I have a new bit. I have a new interpretation. I'm more comfortable with virtual education and distance learning. I'm more comfortable with this environment. I can readily, expeditiously, relatively expeditiously, granted it's expeditious, but there's a profound amount of work in it, but relatively expeditiously go from having absolutely nothing, a blank page, to doing the research, formalizing the notes, shooting the videos, uploading the videos, and moving on to the next, rather expeditiously, right? And knowing that these notes will be held and the videos will be held in perpetuity. So that's the new model. I recognize that some people won't be comfortable in that, and it's not that you should adapt or get out. No, not at all. But the idea is there has to be a recognition, an acknowledgement that this is the new model, this is the new approach. And in terms of this new approach, we need to have our voices heard as well. From in the center, I am the center. Those who are like me are the center. You cannot marginalize my voice because I'm here. It's counterintuitive to think I could be marginalized. I've already arrived. I am that guy. I really am that guy. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not is a personal problem. But I am going to incentivize those who share the same theoretical and ideological dispositions that I have and encourage them to become the next chairs, the next deans, the next editors, the next publishers, and we are going to build the new educational institution, whether you like it or not. So don't think that this is, again, this isn't a negotiation and it's not a threat and it's none of that. It's a recognition of this is the changing of the guard, period. And it's not about people acknowledging me or those like me. It's not about acknowledgement. It's not about approval. I am already here. And the idea is see what I and those like me are doing and capitalize on that financially or otherwise. Use us to protect the things that you hold dear, but don't think that you could in any sense affect this. We are now the center. And this debate, this transition is a natural progression. It's what should happen. And the attempt to try and preserve the old it shouldn't be done. So for those who aren't comfortable doing this medium, don't feel threatened, right? You've earned your position. We're not here to challenge you, but also don't try and ostracize us because then you're in trouble. Then we'll remind you of how powerful we really are, right? You do your thing, we'll do our thing, but don't try and oppress us in our ideological and theoretical dispositions because it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time, right? Again, it sounds ominous. It's not, but the truth of the matter is there is a certain amount of irreverence. You just got to deal with it. It's not my problem. So I think that's sort of obvious. And then lastly, number 3 on page 9, Spivak's concept of the outside in the teaching machine. And I described this, right? You have the margins, you have, and I think the police example was also a good example. The nursing example was a good example. Me and my example ideologically in the center, of academia is a good example. You know, the police officer is eventually going to take off the uniform and go back into the community, but people will forever see him as being associated with that institution. You need to have an institutional transformation. The problem that the community has in terms of the recognition of his allegiance to hegemonic power is facilitated by I mean, you think the Rodney King beating, police brutality, racial profiling, any number of socially real, existentially felt systems of oppression. Well, you're just like them. The idea is, if you're inside now, you, as a minority police officer, have an opportunity to change the system. Like, okay, I want to put a conference together where we talk about racial profiling because, you know, my white colleagues might not, in fairness to them, they might not recognize that what they're doing is profiling. But they'll listen to me because I'm one of them. I don't view this as being a bad position. I feel like I'm in the most powerful position on the planet. I wouldn't trade my position. I'm going to hold this position for, and I know I got a good 20, 30 years to be in this sort of situation before history and technology has changed enough to incentivize a new guard. I mean, the old guard has been here, it might even be more than that. Now I think about it, the old guard has been here for centuries, actually. If I think about it, I probably have more time than I think. The idea is, I like the position that I'm in because in academia, it's ghetto philosophy. Oh, I don't want that, and I don't want to be affiliated with that stuff. That ghetto philosophy stuff is weird. All right, I don't want that. That's not real stuff. It's not rigorous. Okay, cool, no problem. And you go to the street dudes, the hip hop community. They're like, what is this dude talking about? Hegemonic power? What does that even mean? So I'm not part of them. And eventually, you find a middle ground in which you can take the ghetto philosophy and operationalize it so that there's jargon in it. Oh, that's what you mean. And the centrist, the hegemonic control in the center, can see the ghetto, and I can take what would otherwise be too esoteric and via contemporary cultural examples afford those who are marginalized from the spatially marginalized, intellectually marginalized from the center, have an understanding of the center, such that, listen, the center isn't all bad, the quote-unquote man isn't all bad, and the ghetto isn't all ghetto, it isn't all violence. We are more eye to eye than you might think, right? I've done my job. I've done my job, right? It's not going to be that there's going to be kumbaya in the streets and we're going to empty out the prison systems and everyone's going to roast marshmallows and live happily ever after. But you can imagine that the police officer says this in a conference to his colleagues, and they respect him because he's a black police officer and he has merit. Wow, I didn't even think about that. You know, it's that simple. You know, I was raised in a community with a bunch of white guys. I wasn't raised to, think that black guys were all hoodlums. As a fact of my job function, as a fact that cannot be denied, I happen to lock up more black guys than anybody else that I lock up, as a fact. I'm not thinking that I want to lock up more blacks than I want to lock up whites, but I didn't realize that I was seeing people in a different way. Wow, I appreciate the fact that you did what you did. That was a great conference. You really sort of changed my perspective. You don't think that's going to change how the community views the institution? Of course it's going to change institutional perception. Now the community is going to be like, oh my goodness, there are instances of abuses of power, and there are instances in which power is corrupted, but we don't look at the police system as inherently corrupt. I mean, it's unfortunate. It's actually not even funny. It's actually not even funny. There's a belief that policing is inherently corrupt. That's a huge failure in the criminal justice system. There is no greater failure than the collapse of the belief in protect and service. If the community that is quote-unquote being served don't believe that the institution and police officers are actually there to serve, that's a huge problem, right? And it could be changed. It could be changed. Granted, it's not going to result in kumbaya. People are still going to get locked up. But isn't it better to have a state of affairs where people believe that the institution is actually there to protect and to serve? That can't happen without those who are representatives of the community, who are representatives biologically of the marginalized community now in the center, who are marginalized from within the center, using their embodiment and their personal experience as the conduit, the go-between, so that I can offer you access to the hood, and I can offer the hood access to you through me. I'm letting you know I do it every day. Every time I throw up a video, it hasn't done anything but good for me. It hasn't done anything but allow those who are in the quote-unquote hegemonic center proper to recognize various abilities. You think they're not going to operationalize and utilize the stuff that I'm doing? You're crazy. Of course they will. You think ghetto kids aren't going to look at me and be like, wow, that's one way out. You know, I'm not good at basketball. I'm not good at rapping. Dr. Campbell did it. That's one way out. He seems to be doing all right. What's not to love about that? So this section was less about the application of Spivak's concept of marginalization to data interpretation. It was less about participants. It was less about the construction of the theoretical model, and it was all about you. It was all about you. Even if you're a heterosexual Protestant white guy, right? It doesn't matter who you are. We are the next generation of scholars. I'm doing this video for the next generation of scholars. You might be part of the old guard, and no disrespect to the old guard, but you were once the avant-garde, probably fighting those who justified the Vietnam War, right? And you were part of the protest group, you were part of the hippie community or whatever, and you wanted to do away with that. The tides have changed, right? We are the new you. The idea is, in terms of academia, it's important to recognize that this section is about us. We can't forget ourselves in this qualitative methodology. If all of your qualitative analysis is always centered around data interpretation and generalizability and fact-checking and member-checking and participant narrative and the epistemic responsibility for verification of participant narrative and all of that, you're forgetting about self. You're forgetting about you. You're forgetting about us in the center. You're forgetting about what it is we do. We have a job function. We have a social obligation. And that social obligation is to educate. And we have to remember that since we are, or will aspire to be, part of this centrist community, that when we make it to the center, that we recognize ideological diversity, sexual diversity, religious diversity, or lack thereof. Maybe not lack thereof, a more inclusive diversity of religion. In academia, it's already presupposed that, you know, we're all a bunch of atheist heathens. But the truth of the matter is, there needs to be more discussion on sort of any number of religious interfaith belief systems that say, no, you can be a good academic scholar, you can be a PhD, you can do good research, and you can be a Christian, and you can be Muslim, and you can be Jewish, you can be, you can be Taoist, you can be what have you, right? That to be a good academic doesn't mean that you have to forego faith. It might be the trend that a lot of us have, but you can be a good academic and still hold on to your religious beliefs. Granted, when you sit in this position, when you're in front of the audience, it's not about preaching, it's about teaching. I definitely believe that. I would never concede that on any grounds. But in your private life, you can do whatever you want to do. You can believe in whatever you want to believe in your private life. It's just a recognition that education isn't about proselytization, right? If you confuse the two, it's problematic. But there is a marginalization of faith in academia. It is a marginalized community, and I would imagine there's a lot of scholars who actually practice and have religious belief that renounce it for the sake of advancement, that renounce it for the sake of fitting in. Probably more so in the scientific community than any other community, right? And it shouldn't be that way, right? As long as your religious beliefs don't inform what it is that you're doing. Now, this might be different with respect to Islam. It might be, because I know enough to know that that might be different. With respect to, and I don't know much about Judaism, sort of Jewish theology. In terms of Christian theology, I know that you can put that on the back burner and think rationally, and not to say that others can't. But you don't have to use this as a pulpit to proselytize. You can hold your religious belief in Allah and Jesus and God and whatever it is that you believe in, put it on the back burner for your personal life, and still do good academic research. So that there's always going to be a preservation and a recognition of a preservation of marginalized communities, and an attempt to offer the olive branch that, hey, I know you might be marginalized. I feel your pain. You know, if you don't feel like you're being represented because you're LGBTI, because you're a person of faith, because you're what have you, within some centrist position, know that you have an ally here, and I'm willing to fight the fight for you. That's as good as it gets. So with that, I want to conclude the section 1.3. I'll be moving on to section 1.4. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.